Today's topic is being an ally. So what does it mean to be an ally? I'm going to just frame that question a little bit, and then I'm going to introduce our speakers. Actually, I think I'll introduce our speakers first, and then I'll frame that question just a little bit, give a little bit of a definition, a jumping off point for the conversation. And I want to welcome these two amazing, powerful, beautiful women that have honored us and graced us with their presence. Welcome Pat McCabe, returning for her second time to come share her wisdom with us. Pat McCabe is a Dene woman. Some of you might know that as Navajo. She's a grandmother, she's an activist, she's an artist, she's a writer, she's a ceremonial leader, and she's an international speaker. She's a voice for global peace, and she creates beautiful art for healing. She draws upon indigenous sciences to reframe questions about sustainability and balance. And she's devoted to supporting the next generations. She's committed to her part in helping restore the human family, in being functional members of what she has shared with us last time, calling it the hoop of life. So I imagine the hoop of life, and to mend this hoop is the very definition of what it means to be in allyship with each other. And I'm looking forward to hearing what Pat will share with us about that. Our other speaker is Nicole Wires. And Nicole is, by the way, Pat is in New Mexico, I think Santa Fe, is that correct? Okay.
Albuquerque. Yeah.
Albuquerque, okay. And our other speaker is Nicole Wires. Nicole is, she's working with the team at Planting Justice. She's a permaculture designer. She's designing sustainable native and edible landscapes for people all over the Bay Area. Her service work includes organizing what's called the White Noise Collective, and I'm sure she'll tell us a little bit about that, which explores the intersection of white privilege and gender oppression in the struggle for racial justice. And she's been supporting the work in dismantling the prison industrial complex. So Nicole, figuratively and literally, you were digging in the dirt with your brothers and sisters of all colors, genders, and cultures, all backgrounds and socioeconomic status, of those who are struggling to put their pieces of life back together by learning the beauty of connecting to the earth. I imagine that this is allyship in a most human way. So thank you for joining us, both of you. And just to frame the term ally, I was looking earlier what the definition is, because it's always good in any conversation to start on the same page of what we're talking about. So according to Merriam-Webster, and we may want to hone this definition, we most likely will by the end of this conversation. But to begin, it's simply being in alignment with, to support, to be a helper, to join forces. So that's how the dictionary defines it. But I also wanted to give you a quote, and this is on the Google Docs, that I really found very moving, and I felt like it was a good opener for this conversation. And this quote is from none other than Martin Luther King. In a real sense, all life is interrelated. All people are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. Martin Luther King also went on to speak a famous quote about how our destiny is tied up with the destiny and freedom of others. We're inextricably bound to each other in this way. So with that said, I want to lean in now to this conversation and open it with saying something which might sound to some of you might even be a strong statement to begin this with. And I welcome differing opinions and views on this, of course. But I want to just say, I don't call myself an ally. Why? Because I believe this term is only given to me by the person or group with whom I may be an ally to. It is earned and never self-given. And so let's start there with our personal stories. And I would love to start with you, Pat, if that's okay. Maybe we can start with a personal story about who calls you ally and who do you call ally? What does that mean to you?
Thanks, Jul. Well, Martin Luther King would be an ally. Just listening to what you just read, and you know, it's actually not that easy to find human beings who see things that way. I've discovered to really take on the meaning of that interconnectedness, as Thich Nhat Hanh calls us, interbeing, right? And so I know for those of us, Dene, you know, we have this clan system, and we get our clans from our mothers. And so actually I'll introduce myself that way and say, She'e'iya, tachi inashli, aro ashi bashishchi, ma'adishkejne dashanale, klauschi daushiche, kwataus dani inashli. So I'm identifying myself from all these I guess we could call them matrilineal lines, and where they intersect at me, right? And so if I were sitting in a community of my own people, inevitably, as I speak to a room full of people and I say those words, everybody's like leaning in and listening because they want to know, are we related by clan? Because if we're related by clan, then that brings us into a certain, well, family, but also accountability, responsibility, and it's a joyful thing. But really, it's saying exactly what Dr. King said there. It's saying, I can't be well if you're not well. And so that's how our clan systems are. And I'll go so far as to say that my clan grandfather, he was saying one time, so in the United States, they're coming on to double-digit unemployment and everybody's freaking out. And he goes, but here we are, you know, on the edge of the reservation in New Mexico. He was by Shiprock, New Mexico. And he said, we've had 50% unemployment for decades. And he said, so how do we do it? He says, well, we do it through our clan system. We do it through our clan system by that recognition and that bond that we hold as sacrosanct, right? And so so I think about that in terms of the allies for me on a probably the most zoomed out level is for the people who recognize that I can't be well if you're not well. So that is sort of transcending or looking at us as a collective more than, you know, me as a brown Indigenous woman versus somebody who's not a brown Indigenous woman. But right now I'm looking for those people who are considering all the ramifications of what it means to be interbeing.
Beautiful. Yes, that's, oh, that almost invites a moment of silence. Ah, thank you so much. So I'd like to pass it on to you, Nicole, and how you see being an ally. Who do you call an ally, and who calls you an ally, and anything you want to say about what that means?
Thanks, Jul. And thank you, Pat. That was very beautiful, very grounding. Um, yeah, let's see. I mean, I don't actually really use the language of ally or allyship for myself or my movements, the work that I'm involved in. I think it hasn't been a label that I've identified with for many years. There is another Dene activist, Clee Benelli, who wrote a really powerful, very short article called Accomplices, Not Allies, Abolishing the Ally Industrial Complex. And really drawing attention to the importance for folks to recognize our own stake in the work that we do. The work that I do to abolish the prison industrial complex, to transform, white supremacy culture or a culture of capitalism that's founded on kind of a racist history and continued racist practices. I do this work because I deeply and fundamentally acknowledge that my own liberation is tied to it. The ways that I suffer in the present moment, the things that I struggle with in my day-to-day life, are also caused by those structures and those histories. And so if I'm not engaged in Indigenous solidarity, I'm not working to rematriate land to Indigenous leaders in the Bay Area, to the Ohlone people in the Bay Area, because then I can feel good about myself, or because I think it's morally the right thing. I mean, that is true, but also because I know that my life materially and emotionally and spiritually will improve through the work of transforming the system that we're in that's harmful. And so recognizing all of the ways that I, as a white person, as a person with educational privilege and other forms of privilege, I do benefit from the system. I'm not immediately targeted entirely by it. So I do have material benefits from the system as it is. And yet the harms, the spiritual harms, the emotional harms, the mental harms are far greater. And I know that it comes down to what Martin Luther King said. It's not really different from that quote, that I can't be what I ought to be until you can be what you ought to be. But it's taken a lot of work to deeply connect and understand how my own suffering is caused by the system that causes us all to suffer. And I think that reality is becoming more and more clear in the advent of capitalism, capitalism-induced climate crisis and the public health crisis of coronavirus that we're seeing right now. It's becoming more and more clear to many people how we all suffer individually because of structures of power that benefit some folks over others. But I tend not to use the framework of allyship, but more of recognizing my own complicity and wanting to be an accomplice and co-conspirator to work simultaneously alongside and with folks who believe in building a liberated, more beautiful future that we know is possible.
Wow, that's beautifully said. Thank you so much, Nicole. So let's dig a little deeper. And you brought up that you don't use the term ally. Let's see, somebody's video's there. Hold on. Okay. You don't use the term ally. So maybe we can bring up, well, what are other terms? What's the limitation with that term? Do you use that term, Pat? Maybe we can share a little bit more about that. What are better terms? And what are we talking about? What does it mean to be an accomplice, I guess, is what you talked about, Nicole. So it's more than just doing a good thing, right? Here and there, donating a few dollars or signing a petition, right? Isn't it, you're walking alongside somebody's life. Is that, so I'm gonna hand it back to you, Pat. Would you have anything to add to that or about the term ally?
Well, I guess really when I hear that term ally, I'm feeling, and maybe this is not quite fair or accurate in the way I'm hearing it, but in a way I hear it as though we are trying to, that we're all complicit. I use that word. I like that word. In doing our best in a structure that's failing all of us. And so oftentimes I talk about this power over paradigm. And in the power over paradigm, there's it's might makes right, I guess is how I've been saying it. And so there's an inherent violence in this paradigm, in that we're just a hair's breadth away always. And actually we're seeing that right now, right? With the violence in the streets, with people wanting to impose their will and bringing their AK-47s with them to the state capitol steps and such. So it doesn't take much to brush off the polished veneer of the upper realms of the hierarchy that we see ourselves being, many of us see ourselves being embedded in. And so to be an ally, to me, I get this picture of, I always see it as a pyramid shape, this paradigm, right? And so down at the bottom, you want to try to avoid being down in the bottom rungs, because things get very difficult down there. All the labor, all the fruits of the labor is always traveling up. And so I think part of the structure we're talking about is what happens in between these different levels of this paradigm. And in this paradigm, you have to beat somebody else out in order to have what you need. And so it's so on the one hand, that's the inherent structure of this modern world paradigm. People might call it capitalist or post-capitalist. We can dream, right? Post-capitalist paradigm. But I see it as it's a structure that was superimposed upon the paradigm of the actual structure that we live in, which is this earth. And maybe I see it that way because I'm an indigenous person, and it's been presented to me that there is another way for humanity to be on this earth, not as a dream, but as a reality. There are human beings who live in a completely different structure here in the same place, under the same sky, same water, same soil, same everything, and yet their approach to being here is a completely different way. It's not part of this structure. So I have to recognize that I kind of come with this privilege of knowing that humanity knows how to live here in a completely different way. And so when I think about this allyship that we're talking about, we're saying, so it's a crazy making situation, because we have this very violent power over paradigm, and at the same time running through this particular I'll call it a nation, this United States of America superimposition, is we also have these puritanical Christian values. So on the one hand, we have to club each other to get what we need in this paradigm, and we're trying our best to be nice about it. We're trying our best to have Christian values and be kind to our neighbors, and etc. And these two things are like completely opposed. I don't mean to necessarily knock on Christianity, but Christianity is very embedded in colonialism and colonization. And so in that way, those principles, even if we don't adhere to the entire doctrine, or we don't call ourselves practicing members, it's embedded into this United States for sure, which then again has an impact globally, right? And so I feel like when we're talking about that word ally, we're actually, it's embedded in that terrible, terrible conflict of trying to meet these two things, trying to have right relations with each other in a situation that is inherently designed to pit us against each other. And so for me, I'm also got my eye and ear out for people who realize that this is not the only game in town, that there is there already are, and there can be, and I believe there will be again, other possibilities for us being in here. So I'm looking for those allies who have that that space of being able to open up enough to see that this is a paradigm choice, and it's a choice among many choices. But for many of us, those of us who don't have a culture, a living culture to reach out for in this moment and say, I'm I'm going to call my clan grandmother and we're going to talk about, how do we see this? So many people on the earth don't have that available to them necessarily, but there's this feeling arising that there's got to be something else. And this virus has broken down so much of that structure. All of a sudden, they're having to give us some money to just keep, in hopes that, eventually we'll get capitalism back on track. They're gonna have to give us lenience for not being at work. So the structure is doing this, and I think it's opening up places for people to feel the possibilities for other kinds of relationships, economically, in health, in education. I mean, all of our kids are suddenly flung upon us, and that's not usual. And so all these other possibilities for paradigm, I think, are in the hopper at the moment. And so I guess if I were going to use that term ally, it would not be embedded in this system. It would be in terms of who is in a position to imagine something outside of that paradigm.
Wow, I am just so grateful that you brought up that topic, and because it really helped shine a light for me on running up against what I wasn't able to articulate, this kind of undercurrent challenge in trying to be in solidarity. And I've watched, and it does seem to have to do with living in different worlds, doesn't it? Different systems. And I've watched people so this brings up a question, and then I want to pass it back to you, Nicole. But the question is, do we need to step into this other system of somebody that we're being an ally or an accomplice or in solidarity with? Do we need to step into their system, or can we find ways to build bridges across, even though maybe perhaps our system is dying? I mean, I am also post-capitalist, but people have different views about that. Do we need to step out of this system to truly be in solidarity with those of other systems? So pass it to you, Nicole.
Wow, such a full and complex question. I feel like there's many directions that could take us, but I would say a number of things. First, I think that it's very, very challenging we aren't outside of capitalism, no matter how much we attempt to build prefigurative institutions that envision the world that we want to live in outside of capitalism. We're still constrained in so many ways beyond our control. And so I often say to myself, like, it still matters that we try. It still matters that we try to build these prefigurative institutions, because in so doing, we reveal to ourselves how capitalism operates in ways that we hadn't known without having tried. So our efforts matter despite the fact that we're being forced to make compromises constantly. And part of our work, I believe, in this moment of transition is to be present to the grief and the rage that arises in not being able to live with integrity to our full vision for the world, because there are constraints that are beyond our control that tie us down. Be present to that grief and rage and not deny it, so that can be a source of power that moves us more towards transformation, rather than moving away from and moving into, whatever forms of dissociation that many of us take, including, just totally checking out or self-soothing through consumerism, or feeling disempowered and that there's no political actions that we can take. And so checking out from that from political organizing or social movement building in any form because we feel depleted or depressed. So there's, I think it's an important like North Star to be stepping towards the world that we want, and to acknowledge that there are limitations that are sort of beyond our control. So it's a both and it like the effort matters. I also want to say, and I don't think this was exactly your question, but I do think it's important to name that specifically around the framework of like solidarity and allyship. It's important. I believe it's like a fundamentally important work of white folks, and white folks specifically, but really all of us, to do our own cultural work to reclaim our own ancestral heritage as much as possible, recognizing that my people were colonized too thousands of years ago before we became the colonizers on this land. And so it's even farther for me to connect with some of my ancestral heritage. It's harder. There's many layers of colonialism and capitalism and white supremacy that have taken me from that. And yet, like, it's not my position to step into someone else's paradigm or their culture and claim their cultural practices, even if they feel more liberatory. So what I'm talking about is cultural appropriation, right? And the importance of honoring and respecting cultural differences that from folks who maybe have different histories and different backgrounds than us, who we are accomplices or who are working together in movement work. But just as important, I think, is to like do the practices to work to reclaim our own cultural practices. And sometimes for me personally, that looks like I feel like I'm going through the motions. Like I feel like I'm not fully in it. And yet I still, you know, before shelter in place went into place, I would like go dancing at an Irish Ceilidh dance once a month, because it was like one of the times that I could hear the music of my ancestors and learn their dances and feel I love dancing and feel enjoy and embodied in my body and feel that connection and know that I have that history. And I think for all of us, grounding in our own, as much as we're able, our own ancestral histories and roots and cultural practices in order to fortify our efforts to be able to be in relationship with folks who are different from us without needing to gain access to their practices in order to feel whole.
Wow, thank you so much. I totally agree with that. And yet it also brings up a complexity, a confusion. And I'd love to ask Pat if you have any insight on this. I'm sure you do, around people co-opting Indigenous practices because they don't have, I mean, they want to be in solidarity, they want to be in allyship with Indigenous peoples, and they are rejecting, maybe they don't know their culture, maybe many of us are mixed cultures, so we don't even know which culture to go and reclaim. And so that's a difficulty. And so, but they're attracted to Native American, for instance, practices and take them on. And we've been, of course, we all know about this and co-opting practices, but are there circumstances where that is okay because they're doing it in the right way, or they're accepted into a community of people that are you know, calling them an ally, calling them in solidarity. So I'm going to pass that to you, Pat.
That's that easy one to me. Okay. Here's where I lose friends. No, I want to back up a little bit though to what Nicole was saying before before we get into that. Yes. So I feel like if we take time to, one, learn a little bit about our own histories. So this is even more tangible in some ways than trying to reconstruct cultures and practices and spiritual practices from, you know, a long time ago. But even just to understand some of the history, I just feel like in this country, well, I mean, I sat through American history classes in which we had Native American segments, and I, you know, I'm like, I mean, I didn't quite, it was very disorienting to me. I mean, I wasn't raised, you know, my history is the history of the United States in that, you know, all of my people, I mean, I'm a survivor of a people who survived attempted genocide. And so, which I didn't know for a long time, honestly, because when our people were taken into the concentration camps down in southern New Mexico, many of us, we just had our anniversary of that first long walk march for 400 miles down to the southern part of the state a couple of days ago. And so we had that happen. And then we had, in order to get out of that, we had to agree to send our children to the schools that were made by the US government and the church. They became partners and allies in this. Interesting to me, very interesting. How did that happen? So, and so then their whole purpose, they said, they wrote it out. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't some kind of backroom CIA secret. This was like right out front. They said, we want to make these people's own culture so repulsive to them that they will never return to it. So they really used this system of taking young children and imposing ideas into their heads about who they were and who they were not, applauding and upholding Eurocentric values and understandings, and really vilifying and condemning violently any leaning towards indigenous understanding and way of knowing. And so my grandparents were taken into these schools, and then they sent their children to these schools. And that's where my parents met. That's where my grandparents met, and then that's where my parents met. So all that is to say that by the time I came along, no one was speaking our language around me, and no one was practicing any of our ways around me. I feel like it's also important for you to know this, to know who's talking to you, because you might make assumptions about, you know, that I think a lot of people feel like, wow, Native Americans just have it already made for them, and they just, you know, step into these beautiful songs and amazing prayers and traditions that are on postcards and memes and everything, and we just go merrily along our way. It's like, no, man, no, not at all. We have had to fight to hold those things. We have had to fight for it. And so, in fact, for me, it was never even presented to me. So I thought I was an American girl when I came here. It took 2 decades for me to realize that there was another layer to me going on here. And so to know that history and for me to say it here is important to me, because where are you going to get that history from? Where are you going to get that perspective of what it's like to be me from? You know, you're not going to find it in any book anywhere. It's not documented. But I'm also going to say the same thing is true for Euro history. You know, I got to learn through some aspects of Euro history and how it overlaps with indigenous history through ceremony and through vision, because the history that I needed to know about was not in any book either. And it had to do with what took place during the witch hunts in Europe. And so what took place during the witch hunts in Europe was a very long, drawn out, bloody, and I mean bloody, destructive battle to break down the way of the circle, to break down the way of the feminine spiritual leadership and understanding, and also the breakdown of the men's upholding of life. And have that be transformed into this way of the pyramid. So the way of the circle got pushed into this way of the pyramid, right? And what I learned in that ceremonial exploration was that the people, you know, they fought this for hundreds of years. It took hundreds of years to accomplish this breakdown. And you know what that means? That they fought it. They fought it like we are fighting it right now. And so what I learned about that is that those men who had to watch their mothers, sisters, grandmothers be destroyed in front of their eyes. I mean, they made the kids watch. You know, they perfected all of their techniques for breaking down the human and their bond to earth and their bond of I can't be well unless you are well. They perfected all those methodologies in Europe, and then they sent them on the boats, and then those boats found us all over the world. And it was those men, or the sons of those men, or the grandson of those men, who had to watch their own women be destroyed. They were traumatized, they were terrorized, they were, you know, it's a very particular violation for a man to have to watch something be destroyed and be helpless to protect. That is a very serious and deep spiritual violation. And that has played out through this colonization process. So for me, you know, if just knowing this history, take a moment for all that. Just knowing that history helps us understand a little bit more about how to step into these places. It does for me, how to step into these places. It's teaching me that, you know, I say to my European relatives sometimes, you know, all those blows that you gave to fight this might have been one less blow that my people had to take ultimately. And that might have made all the difference, because that way of the circle, that way of the honoring of the woman, that way of the men upholding and putting all of their fabulous mental prowess and their physical strength towards the support of thriving life, that allegiance that we have is still in my, so now it's in my presence, it's in my awareness. And I can say that, you know, it has helped me to bridge myself with men, and especially the European male. And it has helped me bridge between my culture and European culture. So just having a little bit of willingness to go and explore what is our human history. Even in the last, you know, 5,000 years, we have a much longer history than that. And that's a whole nother ball of wax, but there is that. So that's something that we all can do. And then to just come to your question, I'm going to sidestep it a little bit, because here's what I want to say is that we, you know, what that way of the pyramid, or that way, I don't know how to talk about this. I guess it is part and parcel of that way of the pyramid, the power over paradigm, was to guide us to go completely into intellect. And this is a primary difference between Euro culture and indigenous culture. In indigenous culture, we have managed barely to maintain a broad spectrum of ways of knowing. And every indigenous culture on every part of the planet, this is a hallmark of our cultures. We have song, we have dance, we have visioning. And because you can find us in every part of the world, I'm going to say this is a human capacity. It's not just a capacity for people who look like me. This is what human beings are capable of. But for some of us, all that got narrowed down to here. One way of knowing, intellect. Now we need our intellect. But I sometimes joke and I say, you know, if like you say, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, if all you have is an intellect, everything looks like a problem to be solved and a case to be made. And so part of the difficulty with our right relations across gender, across race, across, you know, all these different divides that would be proposed, is I feel like, you know, the intellect knows how to make the airtight case for anything and everything. And so this is how we enter into this time of the call out culture. We call everybody out no matter what they say, whatever word they use, we're on it, man. Pounce, 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 and pounce again, right? So we can't even talk about right relations. And I'm going to say that that is because it's completely dominated by intellect. Now, for me, when I have a problem with somebody and I go and I know what their problem is, and I know how they screwed up, and I start to, I'm carrying that, and I go into a ceremony. Say I go into the sweat lodge. I know what my airtight case is when I go into that sweat. But then I sit there in front of the stones and the fire and the water, and my intellect gets shoved all the way to the back of the line. And instead, it's my body, my heart, and my spirit are in the lead. And that will last for at least 4 days for me after I come out of that ceremony. And so with my intellect pushed all the way to the back of the line, when I emerge out of that ceremony, there are possibilities that I never saw before for what I could do with that relationship. Because it's not an airtight case. Relationship making and relationship building is not an intellectual exercise. I always say, try having a romance with your intellect only. It can't work. So I've talked a long time, but I wanted to say that.
Ugh. I'm just very grateful. You just shared so much. There's so many different threads in there. And there's one in there that I definitely want to speak to, but I'm wondering, Nicole, if you're feeling like you have something alive that you want to speak to first.
I mean, so many things. Yeah, I really appreciate, Pat, everything that you are sharing with us. But Jul, feel free, go ahead if you have something.
Well, it was just going back to what you were saying, Pat, about the Europeans and the trauma of the breaking the circle in women. I very much relate to that. I was deep in that study myself at one point in my life, and it made me think, that trauma, I know we had our last discussion was about trauma, so it's kind of coming up again, but that, I mean, everywhere you dig down and you find trauma, find trauma, right? And I'm wondering if that's the level that we find authentic connection with another culture, that we dig down far enough that we get to that authentic place of really seeing the pain that perhaps another community or another culture has had to endure, even if they are the perpetrators, for instance, like you were talking about, the colonizers, but going back to the pain that caused the colonizer to even exist. But I'm just musing on that. Like, do we need to get to that level of, to find that place of trauma or pain in a culture, to then step in and just have that authentic, okay, I understand now, I connect, and there's more of a real relationship. So that's all. Nicole?
Yeah, thanks. I certainly believe that is a powerful vector for connection, is seeing just the human suffering in all of us, in another, and empathy, and knowing how it feels to hurt myself. Witnessing that in others is certainly a source of connection. I think, dovetailing off some things that Pat was saying, and going back to actually kind of your initial question of, if ally is maybe not a word that I use, what would be some words that I would use? And a label itself isn't so important to me. It really is just about relationships. Like, I'm Nicole. To the folks that I'm in work with, I'm Nicole, and people know the work that I believe in. They know where I struggle and what I suffer with. They know, I'm not perfect, of course, by any means. They've seen me be creative and resilient and open-minded, and they've seen me in trauma response where I'm confused and shut down or afraid or angry, and we've witnessed each other in our full humanity through doing work together. And it's, it's not always pretty, and that is actually an important part of what it is for me to be in right relationship, is being able to hold each other in all in all of the ways that we show up, knowing that we are full complex humans, and we show up holding like personal heartbreak and collective heartbreak, and also personal joy and collective joy. I mean, yes, trauma is a thing that connects us all, and trauma is also an incredible source of learned resiliency. All of us who have suffered from trauma have developed such wise ways of actually keeping ourselves and each other safe. And sometimes those adaptive strategies end up not being so helpful in the present moment, and we have to learn how to let our adaptive strategies go gently. But they also are a massive source of wisdom. You know, as young people, our ancestors, many people fought very hard, as Pat said, to survive in order for us to be here. And we carry both that trauma, but that resilience and that wisdom. So seeing each other in our resilience and in our wholeness and in our wisdom is also a source of connection. But fundamentally, yeah, to me, doing powerful work is about being in real relationship, not being in some superficial relationship or a relationship that's only present under certain terms, but it's being able to be with each other through challenging stuff, through joyful stuff, to celebrate our wins, to grieve our losses, to care for one another in mutual aid, as we're doing in these moments of really unexpected transformation. It's all of that.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, as both of you were speaking, I was having a flashback to Standing Rock, and having been in that camp for a couple months in the winter, and experiencing the kind of the height of where the attacks were. And I remember when the attacks were, I remember it's almost like I could feel the birth of what it meant inside me, the birth of what it meant to be an ally or to be in solidarity, by being in the place together, you know, in witnessing and in exposing myself when out of choice. They didn't have a choice, but I had a choice, and what that meant to me. So I just was musing on that right now, and I don't have any really fully formed, complete thoughts about that, but I just know that it was just in sharing something that was truly profound, made it so that I feel like I can't, it's not something, it's just a one-time thing. You go help, and then, okay, now I'm going back to my life. It's like it changed my life in a good way, but a very hard way too. It's not been easier. It's been harder for me since Standing Rock, but I'm not complaining, because there's something that's deepened, and it has to do with what it means to stand with another person who is outside of the circle that I've been exposed to, is outside of my background. And I'm still trying to understand this, but I wanted to speak to that because that's coming up for me right now. And it's, I also want to say, it's not to, I feel like it's important to not go, oh yeah, I did this, you know, I'm an ally. And that's why I don't believe in giving myself that term. But I don't know what I am if I don't give myself that term, you know. I just believe that we are all in this together, and we are inner being, we are interconnected. And how do we do this together is something that is so alive, that question. So I'll leave it at that. Whoever wants to jump in.
Yeah. So I think part of it is when we share each other's consequences, right? That's a very deep bonding piece. And as you say, some people might not be, you know, it's a choice, and some people it's their life. So there is a little bit of a difference, but there's something that happens when someone is willing to share our consequences. Yeah. And I wanted to say, and I'm sure Nicole is really aware of this, but I wanted to, so in this story of talking about the histories and knowing that people of European descent have gone through a similar thing, if you just hop right into a native community and say, well, gosh, we know the same experience, you're going to end up in hot water immediately. I'll give you fair warning about that, right? Because there is something about currently going through it and having it being an ancestral piece. But to me, it helps me in terms of my ability to have compassion, you know. And I will say that something that I've been working with, so here's that place of vulnerability, I suppose, is feeling like, wow, I think actually part of what makes me spend a lot of time in a lot of Eurocentric venues, places, crowds, etc., is because I actually have this place of holding the high ground, I feel like. And so I'm trying to give insight from that place. And so I've really been thinking about that. What is that about? And does that make me a good ally or not? You know, I don't know. But I will say that, you know, and I listen to my daughter, some of you may know Lila June Johnston, but she holds this part of the spectrum more than I do. But we share this one place where I can say, you know, so to me, I feel like the fact that I'm speaking as an Indigenous person is significant for all of us, because I say, you know, if sustainability is the highest and most sought after technology on the planet, who should we be talking to? We should be talking to those peoples who've known how to live in one place over an extended period of time, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 5,000 years, 10,000 years, 20,000 years. And yes, there are those people in relative health, harmony, and happiness. And so if we're saying, gosh, what we really need is some serious solutions for sustainability, then those are the true scientists of that science that we're looking for. Like, they're the premier scientists of it. And so it matters, this perspective of Indigenous peoples is relevant to all of us, in my view. And so I don't say that just because I'm an Indigenous person. It's a logic that makes sense to me. And I guess I'll go back a little bit and talk about this intellect versus a broad spectrum of ways of knowing. So is it an accident that these people who have held deep sustainability in place also have a broad spectrum of ways of knowing? Is that an accident? No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is. And so what that says is that there's a call. If we truly want to move into sustainability, then we are going to have to change our modality for understanding, for perceiving, for knowing, for sense making, and also then for relationships. Because I believe that the reason that these peoples all over the world, all over this earth, had this capacity was because all those other ways of knowing gave them an ability to be in relationship with place that is not a relationship that can be attained through intellect only. And it also can't be attained through extreme individualism. It's something that is come to by opening up this broad spectrum of ways of knowing in a collective, in a community, in a human community, but also in a community of the local waters, the local mountains, the local stones, everything like that. And so that capacity, you know, this is why when the early ologists came and they were looking at indigenous people, they couldn't make sense of what we were doing, because in their minds, you can't talk to water, you can't have conversations with trees, you can't, you know, if you visions were unknown to them, because these are not capacities of the intellect. And so their only conclusion was that we were primitive and childlike people. But now that we have this long vision of who were these people and what were they actually up to, now this is why I'm invited to speak all over the world. We want to hear from, like, well, what do you guys think about economy, and what do you guys think about health, and what do you guys think about, because we're coming at it from a completely different place. And so in that sense, I feel like, you know, I know the Kogi in the indigenous people of the Sierra Nevadas in Colombia, who I consider the elder of elders in many ways, you know, they call themselves elder brother. And so in that sense, I do feel that there is this place that indigenous peoples are elders in some ways in humanity, because of this history of knowing right relations such that we can participate fully in creating and making a way for life to thrive. And so yeah, we are holding a place within another paradigm, and this other paradigm is starting to wake up to who we are, but not fully. There's still a great part of that paradigm and the people involved in that paradigm that would still call us primitive children. And so, so for me, I have to find my compassion. And I guess that might sound a little arrogant. I don't mean it quite. It's never going to serve me to go into arrogance, but to really be that person, to at least be the one pointing out and saying, "Are you guys noticing this? Are you guys noticing this?" Like, that's my role.
Can I ask you a question about this, because this is so. I'm so with you, and I totally believe and feel that what you say. And the struggle I see too is that you know, a lot of people, non-Indigenous people, inviting you to speak, and people wanting to do, you know, to make these connections, but it's not an allyship at this point for many of these people. And what is it, and what does that look like for non-Indigenous people to become allies of Indigenous people, to support their teachings and what they have to offer? You know, what does that look like? How do we do this?
So I'm going to sing a song to answer this question. Oshe makaina, hey aho ye wa yelo yo, eh yo. Oshe makaina, hey aho ye wa yelo yo, eh yo. Oshe makaina, maka kijelo. Hey, hey, ho. Oshe makaina. Hey, aho, ye, wa, yelo, yo. Hey, yo. Oshe makaina. Hey, aho, ye, wa, yelo, yo. Hey, yo. Oshe makaina. Maka kijelo, hey, hey, ho. So that song says, Mother Earth, I'm sending out my voice to you. We're suffering. Mother Earth, I'm sending my voice out to you. We're suffering. So I'm reaching out to this Mother Earth to answer this question, because it's a really important question, and I want her to to answer it if I can hear her. And what I hear when I sing that song and I attempt to put some words to it is, if you can send your voice out to this Mother Earth and present yourself to her and tell her that you're sending your voice out to her, and tell her that we're suffering in our relationships, we're suffering in our ability to participate and align with thriving life, with her thriving life way, because she's blasting life all the time, all the time, all the time. We try to keep things paved and put the asphalt down, and here she comes just busting through it with this life, you know. And yet, even though that life is bursting all around us, we try not to see it, and we're trying to just get on with what we call our business here. But if we can turn to her and say, you know, Mother, that which gives me everything I need to take care of everyone I love, what would you ask of me right now? What would you ask of me right now? What would you teach me right now? What can I be? What can I do? How can I feel? What can I be thinking other than what I always think? What can I be feeling other than what I always feel? What can I be doing other than what I always do? Show me, teach me. You know, any Indigenous person that witnesses another human being saying that is going to have their heart touched and opened in some way. Because that's where our heart, I think, really wants the most, is just to see us together, humanity, turning and saying, how do we align with life? And in order to do that, we do have to think 7 generations ahead. So it's not about busting big moves. It's not about big ideas. It's about alignment. It's about harmony. It's about coherence, collaboration, cooperation. And so, you know, anyway, that's what she says. She says, if you wanna be an ally with an Indigenous person, humble yourself before this earth, humble yourself before life, and ask for guidance. And I can't imagine a single Indigenous person in the world faulting you for that and not wanting to try to find some way to have some kind of relationship, you know.
Thank you so much for that. You touched my heart, Pat. You touched my heart deeply, and I feel that, because the colonized mind wants to have 7 steps to being a good ally, you know, or we'll pay you money and we'll be your ally. You know, that's the colonized mind, and we have to. It's like we're trying to undo how we even think in order to be what it means to be an ally. And this is not just with Indigenous, it's with our Black relatives, all color relatives, just to humble ourselves in knowing that we are not here to find an agenda or come up with a business plan on how or something of that nature, which is what we're so conditioned to think, the way we're so conditioned to think. And I think that's what you spoke at the difference between the capitalist and the Indigenous systems is what you just gave us was the key, the secret, the open secret to how to step out of that capitalist mindset, the colonized mindset.
Mother Earth gave us that. I didn't give it.
Yes, she spoke through you. Thank you. That's the key. So it's there for anyone that wants to take it. And I've spoken enough. Nicole, do you have anything to add to this conversation?
Just feeling very grateful for that beautiful song and gift. Thank you, Pat, and thank you, Mother Earth, for that guidance. Yeah.
not a whole lot to say after after Mother Earth speaks. What do we, I want to go out in my garden now. just commune. But maybe that's really, the title of this, what does it mean to be an ally? And really, it's coming to that, right? Is that what this, and Nicole, you do your ally work or whatever. I know you don't call it ally work, but you work with the land directly in helping and heal. And so it seems to me like you've also are naturally in that path. Is that true?
Yeah, in many ways. I mean, I think it's complex. It's very complex, and there's the possibility for some degree of kind of spiritual bypass that can happen here. I think, I mean, it really is, as I said before, it's a both and. It's following our heart and our intuition, our intuitive connection to the resources that sustain us, the places that make us feel alive and sacred and holy, and also acknowledging, yes, I work as a permaculture designer. I support folks all over the Bay and building relationship to land and growing their own food and medicine. The majority at Planting Justice, the majority of my colleagues are returning residents, formerly incarcerated folks from San Quentin prison who come home to East Oakland, where they're from, to be working in our commercial nursery, cultivating organic certified fruit and nut tree crops, and then planting them all over the Bay to grow food and medicine for folks. So much beauty and hope and joy and revival and connection. And also, like all things, we are implicated within capitalism. The majority of we're a small business. Clients pay us. The majority of our clients are homeowners, which inherently means a certain very high level of wealth here in the Bay. And therefore, many of them are not Indigenous, are not even native to Oakland, are contributing to gentrification. And so I certainly wouldn't say that it's as simple as communing with our garden without being present to the violence of all of that history and connected to the social movements that are working to transform that violence, so that the connection, that spiritual connection to a source of wisdom is present and available for all of us. Because until that's true, it's certainly, I wouldn't just want wealthy homeowning gentrifying residents of Oakland in my work, I'm speaking of my work specifically, to be able to have some way to find connection or to find guidance to their heart and their spirit through that work. So yeah, I really do. I think it's a both and as you said, our mind has been so co-opted by capitalistic and colonized ways of thinking that doing anything other is going to bring a certain amount of discomfort. Am I doing this right? Is this okay? Is this not okay? Is it okay for me to have Native American practices if someone gave me permission to do it? Does that make it okay? So much discomfort. And I do think that actually a huge part of our work is just being present to that discomfort. Even what you said earlier, Jul, many of us come from hybrid backgrounds, many different cultures, so we don't even know what culture to reclaim. Yeah, there's confusion there because of the histories of colonization, because of what whiteness did to white people on this land. We lost our own ethnic indigenous heritages in order to assimilate to a structure of power that gave us power over, as Pat was describing, the power over paradigm. So yes, we don't know that. Many of us don't know that. Ouch. That hurts. That's confusing. Whose culture am I supposed to reclaim if I'm supposed to reclaim? All of this, the process of attempting to do things in a new way is going to bring up discomfort for us, and moving towards that and looking at it and welcoming it and acknowledging it, rather than turning away from it and saying, okay, well, if I'm allowed to do this practice if someone gave me permission to do it, which might be true. That's great. That's beautiful. People have good, meaningful, in-depth, long-term relationships with folks who share of their cultural heritage. There's a lot of beauty that can come from that. Absolutely. But I feel that, like, whenever I notice that discomfort, I'm like, oh, right, old friend, you're here. It's because I'm trying to do something different that no one taught me how to do. And I'm just trying to learn as I go, and it's not always easy.
I was going to say, I think that for me, what I find dangerous about my own brand of speaking and what I bring forth, because I'm always asking, please don't let me be deceived. Please don't let me be walking in illusion and delusion, and which is a constant thing, especially if you're trying to listen for the earth and try to listen for spirit voices. like I want, keep me straight here. And so, what I find, and I'm finding it actually within Indigenous culture itself, which is kind of alarming, but it's really hard to, it's like a membrane almost that has to be broken out of intellectualism into the other aspects of being human. And we are so good at conceptualizing everything. And so to be given a practice, say from an Indigenous person, let's say, but to keep it within that intellectual exercise and conceptualization, it's hard because we can't even know when we're doing that if that's what we've known. Like I keep thinking about my own journey of coming to this place of really breaking out of conceptualization of ceremony and experiencing something beyond that, experiencing the healings, experiencing the bringing of rain. That's not an intellectual exercise. That's a relational thing. And as it turns out, the clouds are actually very interested in these conversations with us. And so mostly I find that when people listen to me, they really talk about that fight with their intellect, right? And even as Indigenous people, I feel like we, my daughter and I have talked about this because my father got his PhD in education. My daughter's getting her PhD in education, and they're both speaking 180 degrees from each other right now. And because I grew up listening to my dad, and so I told my daughter, I said, when your grandfather was young, he had to prove that we were human beings first. And then after we could prove that we were human, then he had to prove that we had intelligence. And the only way to prove that you have intelligence to somebody is through their understanding of intelligence, right? You don't get to do it through your own. You have to do it through theirs to prove to them, see, I can do what you can do. And so I feel like my father really brought that full on, getting his PhD at Stanford and et cetera. And saying, anything you can do, I can do better was his game for a lot of times I was watching him. And my daughter is saying, but why are we even playing this game? It's a silly game. And I want to reinvent the game entirely. And so that's her way of approaching education. And I have other friends, I don't know, maybe some of you know Manish Jain and his unschooling and ununiversity and unconferences and et cetera. So there's, a lot of movement around that. But what I got told when I was at this gathering in India was, because it was all Indigenous people, and there were people presenting about their culture from their PhDs. And I learned a lot from it and everything. But in the night, the spirits came to me and they said, they like woke me up, and I was like, uh-oh. And they said, we got a question about this. Like, why are you as Indigenous people explaining yourselves to other Indigenous people through the lens of academia, through the lens of the colonizer, through the lens of conceptualization in an intellectual way, which tried to undo all of your culture. Like, why are you doing that? And they said, we're not telling you never to do that, but we want you to understand the dangerous ground that you're on. Because if you begin to conceptualize yourselves to yourselves, then you will have lost the medicine, the actual medicine, not just for your own people and not just for yourselves, but for humanity. And so you're in very dangerous territory here by conceptualizing yourselves. And that came out of us. Other people were writing about us in universities, and they were trying to interpret things from their lens. And of course they got it all cattywampus, because you can't. That's not a translation that's easy to make, paradigm to paradigm, culture to culture. And so we said, dang it, we don't want you to do that. We're going to do it now. We're going to be in the universities and describe ourselves for you ourselves, what we see fit and the real story. And so we kind of got lured into this place, but the spirit being saying, watch out, because don't you start believing these are concepts and not a living spiritual way, a spiritual relationship. And so that tells us that that translation is not so easy, coming out of the one paradigm into another paradigm, and into this paradigm in particular that I'm describing. And so that's one thing about the cultural appropriation is how can we know when we're not in the concept of it anymore, and that we've moved into the embodiment of it, and the actual relational way that truly affects life and brings thriving life. So that's something else I wanted to bring up while we're talking about this.
That kind of comes full circle, and we want to start kind of wrapping up so we can open it up for questions. But it kind of, what you're saying sort of comes full circle to a question that I sort of lost, that was at the beginning when, Nicole, you were talking about seeking your own cultural history and your indigenous history, correct? And the term indigenous, and how a lot of people talk about, well, we're all indigenous to the earth. What is it? What do I want to ask? Something about us finding our own indigenous roots. Is that a way to find that meeting place between all of us? All races, all cultures, if we all investigated our own indigenous roots, is that a meeting ground for allyship? Either one of you.
I mean, I have plenty of thoughts about this, but Pat, do you want to start?
And we just have a few minutes, so we'll kind of.
Yeah. Well, I feel, like I said, I've sort of been waiting for an apocalypse for quite a while now, frankly. I'm like, this cannot go on this way, and so I feel like one of the gifts of this time, sort of like looking for the vaccine, right? Whatever works, and we don't know where it's going to come from or who it's going to come from. And I feel like we're coming into that time where, whatever true knowledge we have about what makes life thrive, whatever direction it's coming from, the proof's going to be in the pudding. in the time to come, and in a way that's a relief, because we can hopefully put down our weapons in some ways. So I guess that's just what came to mind.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. I mean, I guess I would say something similar to what you said, which is that I do believe that for me personally, having done my own work of understanding my own ancestral heritage, and not just what was my language, what was my music, what were my dances, but also how did this specific concrete history, how did my people come here, under what circumstances, where did they land when they got here, what were they involved in, how did their journey contribute to the history of alcoholism that has been intergenerational in my family, like to the point that I, as an adult child of an alcoholic, have endured a lot of suffering from growing up in an unstable household. I directly connect my personal history to that lineage of colonization, that I know that I benefit materially from. I have access to wealth that was generated through that process. So it's complex. But for me personally, knowing that history has made me more grounded in my own human sense of self, which has made me more available and open for real relationships with other people. So in some levels, yes, it's possible. And I just think it's important not to like look for a formula. It's not going to be the same thing that's going to work for building real relationships in every context, in every situation. Like, to me, this feels like important work for me to have done. And I think that many people might find it to be life-giving and illuminating, and will deepen their own sense of purpose and connection in doing this transformative work. But it's not, we also, it's not like there's a formula that's going to work, that's going to all of a sudden make all cultures and all peoples from all places be able to be in harmonious, right relationship with each other. And the desire to have that, I think, actually is like driven in some way from potential. I mean, I get curious when I notice it arising even in myself, and I ask myself, how much of this is from my training in white supremacy culture? How much of it is from my survivor's guilt? How much of it is me wanting everything to be okay, knowing that like me and people like me have caused so much harm, and I just want that to be washed away and for everything to be fine? And how much is it just my work to acknowledge, wow, like we've perpetrated so much harm, and I might not see it in my lifetime, which doesn't mean that the work that I'm doing is not transformational, but maybe I can just sit with that pain and not look for the answer that's going to make it go away right now yet.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. There's so much richness in that, in everything that both of you have been sharing about this, that any number of threads could keep going. But I think I'm going to read off some questions. I'm going to just ask everybody that's tuning in here, if you have a question, please write it in the chat, and I'll read those off. And just seems like the wisdom so far that we're harvesting here is to be an ally, or what it means to be an ally, is first and foremost, it's about being humble. It's about listening. It's about connecting to the earth. And it's about being authentic with your own lineage, seeking that out, doing your own healing. So seems like those, and then it's about being vulnerable and letting ourselves make mistakes and asking questions. Seems like those are the big kind of wisdom pieces. Do either of you have any other pieces that I missed in that harvest before I ask the questions?
Well, I guess I just want to add a piece. I don't know if you missed it, but I was having this thing, I was meeting with a group, and I ended up getting tweaked about the Eurocentric way it was so the conversation was being held. And so when I was with my own organizing group, I was like, my fantasy would be to be able to work so closely with a group of people from all different differences, I guess we'll say, and to be able to just have the ability to stop and say, okay, let's just stop a second here and say, what paradigm are we operating out of right now? Are we speaking out of right now? And just let's just notice. Is this modern world paradigm? Is this capitalist paradigm? Is this indigenous paradigm? Is this, you know, just to like have that kind, that literacy to understand that human beings have been going about their business here in very different ways, and to really have that be a part of the conversation, and also in the ways that we meet. If we're really working on acknowledging certain aspects of African American history or peoples and their way, and indigenous peoples and their way, then let's have our presenters have some literacy in those things. Let's not have them just be operating in a vacuum of they have this particular specialization and knowledge. But as soon as we start bringing it around to, well, how does this fit into the people who were originally here? Our topic at that time was biodynamic farming. And I'm like, well, what about, how do you see that in relation to land management practices that indigenous peoples had going here? And, you know, they were like talking about indigenous people in the past tense, as though we don't even exist anymore. They were calling us, to my face, hunter-gatherers. I'm like, hunter-gatherers? You know, so like that just complete disconnect. So I think that's just something that I'm bringing up that happened recently that feels like that's a way to be sort of mindful in these conversations, you know?
Oh, thank you so much. That's a very, I did miss that. And that was actually one of the biggest points was that what system are we speaking from when we reach out to form relationships with each other. If we want to build relationships, real relationships, we need to know what system from what we are speaking from and we are living in. Is that, did I say that right? So we have some, Nicole, did you have anything that I missed in that wisdom harvest there? Okay, so we have a few questions here. Let's see. How can we support, from Galen, we've got, how can we support others in our circles in their own explorations of learning to reconnect with their ancestry? He also writes, how can we encourage more of this in our communities? Are there any examples of communities doing this well?
I can start by sharing a great resource that the Catalyst Project and a number of other organizations put together about to support folks who are non-Indigenous in exploring their own ancestral histories. I think it's called like the Decolonial Homework or something like that, but it's a series of questions that you can do together as an individual, but also together in groups to kind of explore some of that history. I mean, it starts with what sounds very basic, and unfortunately, even these questions can be hard for many people to answer, but whose land are you currently on? And what are their struggles, current struggles for sovereignty and sacred site protection and political struggles? And what are ways that you can support? If you're on land where you weren't born and raised, whose land were you born and raised on? And what relationships did you have with that land that fortified you? For example, I grew up in Colorado. I grew up in the land of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute, and I am deeply connected to the mountains there. They're a huge source of resilience for me, and I've always been able to feel safe and connected and grounded in the mountains, and I was able to get access to that as a guest, as a descendant of colonizers on that land. And so what relationship do I have to those folks' struggles, and how can I support their struggles? And it's a series of questions. It looks like Galen maybe dropped it in the chat. That's their website. Yeah, thank you, Galen. That's their website. And I'll forward the questions along to folks, but it is a really helpful group practice that people can do together as a place to start.
Wonderful. Pat, did you have anything to answer to that question, or should I ask another question?
I'll just say briefly, there's an app for that. There's an app for finding out whose land you are on. I don't think it must, the one I put in the notes here is probably not correct because it's not lighting up as a link. But yeah, so there's that, and I just was hearing a good brother, Marcus, was talking about why we do that. So I, what I heard from what he said was why we acknowledge the people whose land we're on is to acknowledge all of the work and prayer and relationship that they have developed on behalf of the five-fingered ones, on behalf of humanity, for that land to be able to hold us. So it might have been now 200 or 250 years since those practices have been done, and the land is doing its best to support us even without those practices. But those practices are what has sustained anything to be able to happen in those places ultimately. And so to be able to acknowledge that, so it's acknowledging the people and honoring them, but it's also acknowledging the human lineage in that place that has allowed it to thrive, such that now we can plop down our big factory on it or whatever we're going to do, so it's just a way to begin.
Thank you. Don is asking, Pat, if you can say something about the proper relationship to the intellect and strategic thinking in Dene culture.
Wow, I wish you could see a picture of this hogan my daughter was just in recently. It's like so spectacular. It's ingenious. So again, proper relationship to the intellect and strategic thinking. That's been a really big question for me lately, is what in the world is intellect good for at this point? It's like it's so overrated and so overused and so dominant in everything that I just want it to go like way back, out of the way for a while, and then maybe later we'll call on it again. But and I'm trying to remember, some of you may know the elder Orland Bishop, but he gave this great answer to that. But I'm really asking about it right now. So I'm thinking about my clan grandfather, and he used to talk about he used to really try to contain himself. He had a PhD from San Diego State, but he really tried to contain himself within our cultural understandings. And he used to say, we have a way of describing anything that European culture can describe. We have a way of describing Shakespeare, he used to say. And so, and I've heard of other people, young people who went off to school, Tobasanequet from Canada, or from First Nations Canada. He was talking about how he went to university and he came home, was feeling all cool and groovy, and got into the sweat. And then he heard his elders describing the theory of relativity in the sweat. And he realized, wow, we've been talking about this all along. So again, it's not so much that it's not about intellect and strategy. It's about the way that intellect and strategy is embedded in the interbeing. It's not a standalone thing, and it's not meant to bring us to the pinnacle. We're not here to be rewarded, to have the very best idea and patent our idea and get rich on it. It's about the way that it serves that interbeing. And there's actually a little bit of a line, even in my ceremonies, I say, I don't want any hard mind around the fire. Like, you got to leave that out there and don't bring that. So what do I mean by hard mind? It's like that really fierce argumentative way, the trying to get your point in way, certainly not political arguments. Like, none of that's going to be around the fire. We got to humble ourselves around that grandfather fire. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what the question brings up for me.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great answer. Let's see. Jack is asking, as to us white Europeans, can us white Europeans benefit from researching our ancestry? I think it can be a good thing, but my thinking is that we are more distant from our indigenous roots and thus maybe can't view it in the same way as people who are not so removed. wondering what the panel thinks about that. I'm not sure if I understand that question, but maybe you guys could pick up on that. Something about researching ancestry the further away. Oh, good, you're there. Thank you.
Yeah, could I
Yes,
bring it up?
yes, please ask.
Because I mean, yeah, well, my thing is that I spent a lot of time on the Dene Reservation, or as some might call Navajo Reservation. And I mean, I just noticed while I was there were just certain things, like, I'm going to give one instance. I'll try not to take too long. But like, we would be in one place, and then the group would say, yeah, we'll meet over there later. And everybody would arrive at the same place at the same time so often that there was a certain understanding that I found that the Dene people were so much closer to those roots, those indigenous roots and ways of dealing with things, that I just say that we can learn from looking at our own past, but I think we don't have as close a touch to it, and maybe it's a little more difficult, or we get a different kind of learning. I went on too long, but I'm done.
Thank you, Jack. Either of you like to comment on that? Maybe
Yeah.
it has, oh, sorry.
I mean, I do think it's true that it has been, we are farther from our indigenous roots. And just, again, I mean, I've already said this in many forms, but just acknowledging the true grief of that, I think gives us more resolve in efforts like rematriating indigenous land to indigenous stewards in contemporary times. Like, I would be remiss not to name, for folks who are in the Bay Area, if you have not heard of the Sogorea Land Trust, it's the Ohlone and Urban Indigenous Women's-led land trust that was formed for folks to reclaim access to their lands. And there's a voluntary tax that people who are not indigenous to this land who live here can pay. It's called the Shumi land tax. And they're using the money generated from that tax to acquire properties, to be able to repatriate it to indigenous stewardship, to build sacred ceremonial sites, to be in ceremony and in community with folks. And we at Planting Justice, where I work, are deeply connected to Sogorea Land Trust, and all of our clients who we build permaculture gardens for all pay their Shumi land tax in order for us to build a garden for them. And we've also deeded the first parcel of land to the trust. It's a 2.5 acre piece of land in deep East Oakland, right on Lishan Creek, which was a sacred waterway for the Ohlone folks, is a sacred waterway for the Ohlone folks. So that's a really concrete example in the present moment. And my resolve and my commitment to that, to supporting that work, is deepened every time like I tap into the grief of not having my own ancestral practices. And when I witness, Ohlone folks being in community, it's joyful and resilient and beautiful. And I also have a yearning for that for myself, and knowing how the violence of colonization has separated indigenous people on this land from their access to those practices, and knowing how it hurts me in just small ways not to feel that for myself, gives me deep resolve to continue in the work. I'm not just doing it because like I think it's a good idea. I'm doing it because I feel my own suffering around what colonization does. And so yes, you might be right that it's harder and more distant. It feels awkward. You can't find the answers. That's part of it. That's absolutely part of the work in my experience.
It seems to me that a lot of this just question about researching our roots, I mean, there's such a big piece of this is our connection to land. And those of us who have been born of immigrants, who are mixed cultures like me, it's like, where is my land? And when Jack was talking about the beauty of being, you know, amongst Indigenous people, the Dene, and the incredible experience, and I've experienced that too with people that are very connected to land. There is a depth that you can't even describe that we're missing. And I think that grief, you know, that you talk about is, you know, my grief too is like, I can connect almost with Indigenous people about the grief of losing their land, because I feel my own grief of not having land. So I'm feeling that some connection around that. And I'm just realizing that as you speak, how much land factors into this. And so how much getting back to the land and reclaiming the land, and what does that look like? And, you know, for us that weren't, you know, that are planting on land that isn't originally ours, you know, can we call it ours? You know, can we steward that? So all those questions start swimming around in my brain, but I know we probably don't have time to, that's another hour of conversation, but I do want to, Pat, did you have anything you want to add to that? Because Don had a clarification on his last question.
Yeah. So I think for me, it's about that recognition that if we each go back far enough, we come into a similar territory of relationship, like a philosophical relational territory of relationship to land and conversation with land that led to certain practices, you know. So I've been saying that culture actually isn't a human construct. Culture is the Mother Earth expressing herself as human being in any given place.
Wow.
And so
write that down.
Culture is not a human construct. It's the Mother Earth expressing herself as human being in any given place.
You got that, Aya?
And so if I think about it that way, then I think, you know, I want to acknowledge the people who she was expressing herself as human being as for 1,000 years, 5,000 years, 10,000 years in a place. Remarkable relationship. It's sort of like, in some weird way, I guess maybe it's like admiring somebody who's been married for 75 years. You're like, wow, dang, you know, what you guys know about each other, everything you've been through, all that stuff, right? So it's, you know, we could maybe look at it a little bit like that and say, you know, so that's their relationship. So now I'm on this spot, and what is my relationship going to be with this place? And so I don't know how, you know, I'm like, I always hate the cultural appropriation question, because I'm like, I'm the last one you really want to talk to. I'm so on the far end of the liberal spectrum that I'm going to get us all in trouble. But it's because I have this sense that, you know, that we Indigenous peoples, certain factions of humanity, we're given the task of remembering original instruction. We're remembering the ways to have this relationship to land, and we were to safeguard them and protect them until the correct time to bring them out. And if that time isn't now, I don't know when it is. Actually, it's probably could have been in the last 30 or 40 years. I think we're actually moving on to a whole new project in some ways, because I don't know if we have time to transmit that knowledge. I don't know if we have time to break through that barrier that intellectualism has created for human beings on the planet. I feel like our time just is speeding up right now. And now we're getting to that place where, you know, whatever you manage to glean is going to help you, and whatever you didn't manage to glean is going to be a little rough for you. And it's kind of feeling that way to me. But I don't know how we get around those who have that relationship to land, not bringing it forth to others. And there's a way that has to be done. And there's reasons for not sharing everything. Because if you haven't burst out of the me and mine into the we and ours, then that relationship can be quite, that information can be quite dangerous to hold. And so there does need to be a protocol and a sense of how much, when, and where, and with whom. But I don't really see how we get around, you know, us just holding it. I have been in Indigenous peoples gatherings where they have said, you know, all those white people are going to get wiped out, you know, and all of us indigenous people are going to, because we've been living right, are going to be spared. And I'm like, wow, that sounds really familiar to me from a whole nother branch of the human family. And I didn't like it coming from there, and I don't really like it coming from us. I don't see how it can be true. I've just never seen Mother Earth behave that way. You know, so I think a lot about, I'm praying a lot with reindeer and all the herd animals, because, you know, they're used to losing part of their herd on a regular basis, and they thrive and they have heart, and so I'm asking them, how do you do that? Because I feel like we're getting ready to lose big swaths of our herd now, and that's traumatizing to us. So I need to understand their medicine for how do you do that and remain in a good way, as we say.
That's huge. Wow. Okay, I feel like, gosh, I mean, there's another whole conversation. Just how do we do this, the time we're in? So I think we'll just let that one rest and attend to, Don was just asking a little bit of a clarification on his last question about the intellect and strategic thinking. He says he was thinking particularly in terms of activist organizing, because he's been doing a lot of strategic planning lately and feel it's important for the benefit of all. So so I don't know if you can answer that or speak to that, Pat, in connection with your last answer.
I can't remember if I already said this here. I'm embarrassed because I know I brought it up in the conversation this morning about activism. And did I already talk about this idea of simultaneously preparing for war and peace here? Okay, good. So that's the message I've been carrying in activist circles for a little while now. Is I've been saying, you know, we actually do have to prepare for war and peace simultaneously, even though our very intelligent relatives said that you couldn't really do that. But we have to do that. Because on the one hand, we need a strategy for really expressing, I do not give my consent here. And I will say that, by the way, you know, our consent, seeing as how this is a free will construct, our consent is a deep power that we have been given. And, you know, I feel like that's a great basis for indigenous worldview, is that every being is a sovereign being, and therefore we have to attain consent in some way from everything we need to take for what we live. So that's why we have all these beautiful practices that everybody loves so much, about making offerings and asking permission. But really it's spiritual law that says, you know, I can't just go running over another member of the sacred hoop of life's way of making life thrive just because I feel like it. You know, there has to be a negotiation. There's a reason for it. I mean, and the other interesting thing about this construct is that we have to eat something in order to live. You know, I'm going to eat a carrot at least to live. So I have to interrupt another being's trajectory. But how am I going to do that? So this is where the relationship business comes in, right? Okay, so I'm kind of getting sidetracked here. So to go back to this place about activism. So we are in this place of saying, I do not give my consent to certain activities. And I do not give my consent to Black people being hunted down on the streets of the United States. I do not give my consent there. I do not give my consent to all the toxic waste being sent to certain places and not others. I don't give my consent. So we're putting up a wall, and that is what we'll call the war. But at the same time, you know, here comes coronavirus, bringing everything to a standstill and bringing many of us to our knees. Even those ones that we're trying to figure out all along, how are we going to bring these guys to their knees? And now here they are, you know, this little tiny bacteria has done it. And so I've been saying, you know, there's a willingness that's going to sweep the land. And those who did not want to hear us are going to be able to hear us now. I'm finding that even in my own messages. Those who did not want to align with how important the water is are suddenly going to get it. Those who are trying to align with how important growing food is are suddenly going to get it. So this willingness is sweeping the land. So I feel like as activists, I guess I'm really naming a strategy here, is to be able to go from this to this, and to this, and to this, to be that welcoming in of that willingness, of that awareness, of that sudden dawning. This is what we've been waiting for. So rather than getting all pissy and arrogant with these people, I told you so, you should have listened to me, you know, a long time ago, and getting super involved in this call out culture business, you know, we have to have this heart that can withstand and not give consent, and then welcome in. Yes, let's thrive. Yes, let's thrive. So that's a very deep spiritual endeavor that is also a strategy that is called for from us at this time.
Thank you. Yeah. Ooh, wow. Wow. Preparing for peace and war. Just letting all that kind of soak in, and everything that's been said, just soak into the ground here, all these beautiful hearts and minds that have been listening in and who will listen in the recording. And just taking a moment to let all this wisdom, this sharing, to just enter our beings, our interbeing, allow us to just open that much further towards that world of peace that you're talking about, preparing for, that we're here together to build. So thank you. So we have a couple minutes just to close, and I don't feel like I even want to close, so maybe we'll leave an open circle here, an opening instead of a closing. How's that for this discussion? That there be more.
A clopening, we say, huh?
A what?
A clopening.
A clopening. Let's have a clopening right now to continue this dialogue. Oh, well, I don't know. That Don is asking the question again.
I don't need.
I
just wanted to put that out there.
Okay. Okay.
The short answer to that question for me is I don't think green, sustainable technologies are going to solve our dilemma. We're in a crisis of relationship right now, and until we get that crisis of relationship straight.
Yay. Thank you for speaking the truth on that. So let's continue this relationship building and continue the conversation in some form or fashion, and keep having the courage to show up and ask the difficult questions and be vulnerable, and just deep gratitude to both of you, to the work you're doing, you're showing up for the work, showing up here. Thank you for all the people that have been listening in. Thank you to Galen. Thank you to Ayako, to Dawn, to Transition, and all the amazing people that have been part of that movement, you know, because we are working towards that, and holding the heart right now seems to be the most important thing as we move forward in this time. And I also forgot, but I want to make sure, I almost forgot to make sure and let everybody know that Pat is supporting the Diné people they're having quite a COVID crisis. And she is supporting them getting the supplies that they need. And so she is accepting donations, and you can, let's see, why don't you, Pat, you want to tell them how they can get a hold of you or anything else they need to know about that?
So that's my website. I just put in the chat, patmccabe.net. And if you want to contact me about making donations, right now I'm splitting them between two people who are really directly on the ground, getting the food and getting the PPE supplies. And I'm kind of going back and forth between them with the funds. And we also have a nonprofit if you need to make a tax deductible donation. And just getting food out to the rural places, and then also getting that PPE equipment out to peoples. I will say that my friend who's donating food supplies is telling me that those elders who are living the really traditional lifestyle way out there, they're not having any problems at all, which is not, I guess, a total surprise, but just to confirm that that's also true. It's those that have kind of been in the in-between and in government housing and more condensed areas that are having great difficulties right now, disproportionately to the rest of the United States.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Nicole. And thank you, Pat. Thank you, everybody. And this will be up on our new YouTube channel. So if you missed anything, want to hear it again, it'll be there. And we are going to continue our conversations. So stay tuned for what's next.
Deep bow to you, Nicole.
Likewise, very nice to meet you.
Yeah, I think you and my daughter should have a conversation. That would be a lively one for sure. Thank you.
Blessings. Good night, everybody.